So, as promised in the previous discussion, we are now going to look at some features of selection more from an experimental point of view. Also, much of the stuff that we discussed in the last 2 or 3 discussions, they were related to what is happening at the level of the allele frequency. For this particular discussion, we are going to focus more on things that are happening at the level of the trait. In other words, we will be focusing more on what is happening at the trait distribution level. Okay. So, the first feature of selection that one really needs to keep in mind is that selection acts on individuals, although the effects of selection are visible at the population level. So, think about the Darwin-Finch's cases for which you saw that HHMI video. The individual finches, when under the drought condition, it is the individual finches which are either surviving or dying, which are either reproducing or not reproducing, and so on and so forth. And yet, if you study what is happening in terms of evolution, then and also natural selection, we are essentially looking at the trait distribution at the parent generation and comparing that with the trait distribution at the offspring generation. In other words, both of which are population level stuff, right? And this of course boils down to what we have already discussed, that the effect of evolution is always seen only at the population level, not at the individual level. Individuals will live and die, they do not have temporal continuity. It is only the population which has temporal continuity, and therefore the effect of selection also needs to be seen at that level. Very simple point, but very often people end up missing this concept, which leads to all kinds of issues. Okay. Second point, the effect of selection will partly, not entirely, but partly depend on the shape of the fitness function. Now, what do I mean by the fitness function? The fitness function is a quantitative description of how some measure of fitness, it can be anything, it can be survivorship, it can be fecundity, it can be stress resistance, whatever, but how some measure of fitness will vary with the trait under consideration under the given circumstances. This is very important, under the given environmental context, and I will show you what I mean by that. So, for example, again going back to the Darwin-Finch's example for which you saw the video, when the drought etc. was happening, then the way the survivorship of the birds changed with the depth of the bill, size of the beak basically, that looked like this. Okay. And this thing that you are seeing over here, this quantitative relationship between the survival rate and the bill depth is the fitness function under this situation. Okay, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that this was true when that drought hit, the 1977 drought hit Daphne Major, and when the seeds became very, the small seeds, the soft seeds, they became very, very rare. However, remember, after some time there was a very rainy season, and when that rainy season came, then essentially the entire thing changed. Now it was those birds which had smaller beaks, they were the ones who were finding more food, and therefore they were the ones who were having greater survivorship, and therefore the entire form of the fitness function changed with the change in the seed availability. So, that is what I mean by saying that the fitness function is always context dependent. It is not a constant for a species or anything. It depends on which environmental scenario the organism is finding itself under. Okay. This again needs to be kept in mind. Now, with this concept of fitness function before us, we will talk about 3 major kinds of selection, the so called directional selection, stabilizing selection and disruptive selection. What do I mean by this? So, this is a slightly busy panel, but I will walk you through this. So, if you look at the first row, all you are seeing is some kind of a distribution of some trait. Okay, it does not matter what trait it is, it can be beak length, or it can be body size, or whatever. And as you can see that in all the 3 cases, the distributions are actually very, very similar to each other. I mean, they are the same distribution. Now, the important thing is what you find in the middle panel. The middle panel shows you the fitness function for that particular trait under whatever environment it is. Now, look at this one, the first one. What do you find? You find that as you go from lower value of the trait to the higher value, the fitness continuously increases. So, this is one fitness function. What do you find over here? In this case, you find that the maximum fitness is for intermediate values of the trait, whereas when you go towards either extreme, the fitness goes down quite a bit, right. So, this is the situation where the intermediate value of the trait leads to the maximum fitness, and this is just the opposite of that. Here the intermediate values of the fitness have the intermediate values of the trait have the lowest fitness, whereas as you move away from the intermediate values, the fitness goes up, right. So, you can think of this conceptually as similar to, this one is similar to the underdominance case, and conceptually this is similar to the overdominant case. But the difference is that in the case of underdominance and overdominance, the x axis are the three genotypes, right, homozygote, heterozygote, homozygote. Whereas in this particular case, what you have on the x axis are the trait distributions. That is the critical thing, nothing else. Now, what will happen if you have these three different kinds of fitness functions in the trait distribution after selection has happened, let us say one or multiple times? So, in this particular case, what is happening? The higher values of the trait are being preferred. In other words, the frequency of these individuals is going to be go up, and because of that the mean of the trait value will shift in this direction. Okay. The reason it is shifting in this direction is because the higher fitness is in this direction. If the trait function had looked like this, where the higher fitness was in the lower direction, it would have shifted in the other direction. Okay. But here that is not what we are showing. So, in this particular case, where the highest fitness values are for those individuals who are on one side of the distribution, the kind of selection that you have is known as directional selection, and this generally increases in the leads to an increase or decrease in the mean of the trait value in one direction. How it affects the variation, that depends on what kind of genetics is there, but typically we know it by the change in the mean value. Now, what happens over here? In this particular case, those individuals which are in the center of the trait distribution, these guys, they are the ones who have highest fitness, and all the others have lower fitness on both sides. And therefore, what will happen is that these individuals, they are going to leave behind less offspring, these individuals will leave behind less offspring, and hence the frequency is going of these central ones, these will go up. The frequency of these ones on the two sides, these frequencies are going to go down. In other words, the total variation that is there in the population, of which variance is a statistical measure. So, that variation or its measure variance, whatever you talk about, that is going to go down. In other words, the spread of the distribution which you are seeing over here, this spread is actually reducing, right. This is what is known as stabilizing selection. Now, what is happening in the third case, which is disruptive selection? In disruptive selection, these guys have higher fitness, these guys have higher fitness, therefore, their frequency is going to go up, and these guys, they have lower fitness, so their frequency is going to go down. Okay. So, these guys have lower frequency, so their frequency is going to go down, and therefore, you can see that this is going to lead to an increase in the spread. In other words, the variance of the population is going to go up. Okay. So, I will give you specific empirical examples of each one of them. So, the first example is of directional selection. So, this is a very famous example. This is the famous Illinois long term selection experiment on maize. So, here what they did was that they wanted to improve the oil content and the protein content of the kernels of maize or corn. Okay. So, every generation they took those individuals which had the higher oil content or those individuals which had the higher protein content in their cobs, and only allowed those seeds to be planted for the next generation. So, this experiment was initiated in 1896, which means that right now this is 100 plus 129, close to 130 years old experiment. It's still going on. So, it was initiated by this person called Cyril Hopkins, and it has continued ever since, except for about 4 years during the World War II, during which they had to stop, but they maintained the lines, they did not do the selection, and after World War II they started all over again. Now, what you can see over here, so here we are showing you the oil content graph. What you can see is that over 100 generations, so this data is a little old, okay, over 100 generations the oil content increased by 4.5 times, okay, and the protein content increased by approximately 3 times. So, this is one of the greatest example of how much the selection can change a particular phenotype, to what extent. And frankly speaking, when they started this experiment, this was an experiment to figure out, or experiment to improve the oil content and the protein content. However, at some point they changed the goal of the experiment, and right now the goal of the experiment is to see how long can one push this, what is the limit of selection, so to speak. So, this is one of the very famous textbook examples of what directional selection can do to a trait. We will come back to this in a few minutes. This is an example of stabilizing selection. So, you know that the weight of babies, human babies at birth, is a very important trait, and their survival depends on it. So, turns out that if you have babies which are very underweight, okay, very less weight, so their survivorship is actually very less. On the other hand, if you have babies which are greatly overweight, their survivorship also goes down. It is the intermediate level of body weight for which the babies have the maximum survivorship. You can see something similar in terms of height also. So, people who are very short, we already discussed the example of Peter Dinklage and achondroplasia. Those people, they have all kinds of physiological problems. Similarly, people who are extremely tall, the world record holders and all the 7 foot 6 inches and 8 foot, all those people, many of those people have very high levels of physiological issues. It is somewhere the intermediate height people who actually have relatively less number of physiological problems related to height. So, that is another example of stabilizing selection for height in humans, and what I am showing you is stabilizing selection for birth weight in humans. The third kind of selection that we talked about is the so called disruptive selection, and this example that I am giving you is from toads known as spadefoot toads or Spia multiplicata. So, these toads, depending on the environment that they face, they will end up becoming either an omnivore like this or a carnivore like this. So, there are two different morphologies. Now, very interestingly, either morphology, the body size is relatively high, and in this particular case body size is a measure of fitness, because body size tells you the amount of resources that they have and is positively correlated with a bunch of other traits. So, turns out that if you are omnivore or if you are a carnivore, then in either case your body size is large and therefore you are going to have reasonable fitness, good fitness. However, if you are an intermediate, a generalist, somewhere between the two, omnivore and the carnivore morphology, then actually your body size becomes much lower, and therefore the fitness of this morph is much lower compared to the two other morphs. So, again, this is an example of disruptive selection where the intermediate form has low fitness and the two extreme forms have higher fitness. Okay, so that was number 2. The third and the very important thing is that selection can take the trait values between the starting range of phenotypic values. Now, why am I saying this? If you remember, Darwin started by saying that variation already exists. Selection operates on pre-existing variation, right? But if that be the case, then the corollary to that is that then selection will never be able to take a trait in a population to a value that did not exist in the original population. However, if you remember just a few minutes back, we saw the example of the increase in oil content in the Illinois experiment. Now, in this particular case, if you paid close attention, this red thing that is shown over here, this red thing shows you the range of variation in the starting population, and yet very obviously the population has gone way past that starting range, right. So, if that be the case, obviously new phenotypic variation has come. Where is this variation coming from? Now, there are two major sources of this variation. One, of course, as we have already dealt with, is mutation, and mutation is a very important source. The only problem is that mutation is, in general, as we saw, is a somewhat slow force. Okay, the rate of mutation is not so high that you will end up getting too much of it very fast, and so on and so forth, particularly if your population size is small. So, the other source of variation that is very important for sexually reproducing organisms is recombination. Now, what exactly is happening? So, suppose you have certain alleles. Okay, remember we are talking about traits which are dependent on multiple alleles over here. Now, suppose some of these alleles individually they can lead to slight increase in the trait value, say oil content in this case, but they are relatively rare in the population. Because they are relatively rare in the population, their chances of coming together are very less. Okay. Now, what is happening? Selection is happening. Because of selection, these alleles which individually are also lead to slight increase in the say oil content here, they are getting selected. When they are getting selected, their frequency in the population is increasing. When their frequency in the population is increasing, their chances of coming together into the same organism through the process of recombination, that chance is going up. And once they end up coming together, then obviously because they will lead to a major increase, or if they lead to a major increase, then the chances of their getting selected increases, and therefore the chances of their frequency in the population goes up even further. In other words, what recombination does is it ends up creating these new combinations which then selection can act on. Now, obviously recombination is a double-edged sword, right. Remember, recombination can create new combination, recombination can also break existing combinations, right. So, what is happening over here is that as the allele frequencies, frequencies of those alleles which will lead to these major increases, as those frequencies go up, even if recombination is breaking the combination, it will also again with some probability will bring them together. So, overall, as the frequencies keep on of these favorable alleles keep on going up, recombination will end up bringing them together again and again and again, and each time they come together there is going to be selection happening on those allele combinations. So, in other words, at least for sexually reproducing organisms, recombination itself acts as a major source of variation on which selection can act. Okay. Now, this is the interesting part. Selection for a particular trait very often leads to changes in other traits, something which is known as a correlated response. So, if you remember when we were talking, I told you about a particular experiment that we have been doing in our lab where we are selecting for increased dispersal in Drosophila. And I said that when the whole thing started, the ancestral populations, they had about 4 meter average dispersal ability, and we started with a 2 meter long setup, which over time we have now gone to a 104 meter long setup, right. Now, because of this selection, which is again a huge amount of change in how much they can move, because of this selection, these flies now have become champion dispersers. Okay, the amount of distance that they can move is obviously very large. However, along with that, some other stuffs have ended up happening in these flies for which we had not done any selection. So, to tell you what these are, turns out that these flies, their behaviors have been modified drastically, and these selected flies, they have become more exploratory. So, they tend to move away from their natal habitat, a lot more, and they also have greater aggressiveness. Okay, so they are much more, well, fighter flies, so to speak. Now this thing, okay, this stuff where you have changes that are happening for which you did not select for, these are what are known as correlated responses. Now why exactly are these correlated responses happening? So in this particular case we know what has happened. So turns out that one of the important neuropeptides that allow for greater dispersal is octopamine. Now octopamine is the analog for the human adrenaline, right? So because of dispersal, the octopamine level of these flies have gone up. Now octopamine also ends up affecting other behavioral traits, for example exploration, for example aggression, right? And because of that, the selection was on dispersal, because of that octopamine levels went up, and because octopamine levels went up, these other traits went up, right? So this is an example of a correlated response in dispersal selection, correlated response due to selection. Now please appreciate one thing, that in this particular case, exploration going up or aggression going up, as far as we can make out, is not causing any trouble for the flies. They are not reducing the fitness of these flies in any way, as far as we can make out. However, that is not always the situation. Under many situations, the correlated responses are not good for selected populations, and when that happens, we say that there is a trade-off. In other words, when due to selection or whatever reason, one trait becomes better for the organism, but there are other traits which are actually extracting a cost for the organism, then this phenomena is what we call a trade-off, right? One goes up, the other goes down. So just to give you an example of trade-off, remember we were talking about selection for faster pre-adult development in Drosophila, right? Now remember I told you that those flies, they now come out in about 6.33 weeks or so, which is about 34% faster than the ancestral population. They are the fastest developing flies in the whole world. Great. But what is the cost of that? What is the toll that ability to develop fast has taken on the flies? You can see that here. So here we are showing you the males on this side, the females on this side, and these are the ancestral flies and these are the selected flies. Can you see their body size? You can see that both for the male and for the female, these flies have become much smaller, and this is after about 370 generations of selection, which in terms of evolution is actually not a very large number. Now what is the problem of reducing body size? The problem of reducing body size is that typically many other traits of an organism are strongly correlated with body size. So for example, body size also reflects how much resources you have, and how much resources you have, that then plays a role in terms of things like how many eggs you can lay as a fly, how much you can resist different stresses, and so on. And turns out that with this reduction in body size, these faster developing flies, they have actually become absolutely how do I say, poor flies, okay, in the sense that their body size has gone down, the amount of resources that they have has gone down, their fecundity, that is how many eggs they lay, has gone down, their ability to do pretty much anything has gone down drastically, their activity levels are extremely poor. If you look at their body and if you look at their wings, which obviously if you are a fly is a very important organ for you, the wings are totally deformed. So I am just showing you deformities. So all these arrows are showing you deformities. Look at this one, this wing is completely deformed and is useless for flying. So basically pretty much along any direction that you look at in terms of the flies life history, the flies have paid an enormous amount of cost. They have become much worse along any axis, and yet along the one axis that matters in this regime, which is developing fast, these guys are the world champions. They develop faster than anybody else, right? So this tells you something, that again the fitness of an organism is totally dependent on the context, the environment in which that fitness is being expressed. In this particular experiment, the faster developing experiment, the fitness was entirely determined by how fast you can develop. Everything else was taken care of, everything else didn't matter in some sense, right? But because of that, the flies ended up just reducing their fitness without thinking about any other cost. They didn't have to think about any other cost because everything else was taken care of by the experimenters. The experimenters ensured that they got lots of food, they ensured that howsoever low their fecundity was, all the eggs were taken care of, and they got, they didn't have to fight with any predator, there was no disease under lab condition, and so on and so forth. Now, because of this, the flies ended up becoming worse off along every other direction apart from that one along which the selection was being imposed. Now, this is something that we have to realize is a reality of fitness, of selection. Selection is very focused on what exactly is being selected for. You get precisely what you are selecting for, okay? And the biggest example of that, for example, are us humans. We humans, we obviously have a very inflated opinion of ourselves. We think we are great, and frankly speaking, if anybody looks at the earth, they will say, yeah, humans are doing extremely well. There is no place on this world where humans have not gone. There is no environment which the humans have left untouched. There is no resource that the humans are not exploiting, and so on and so forth. Great. But as animals, we are worthless. We are stupid. You put a human in a jungle, and until and unless that human undergoes a very strong training, the human will not be able to survive. The human will not be able to run. The human will not be able to catch a prey. The human doesn't have the teeth to kill the prey. It doesn't have the claws to do anything. And most of us humans are actually so unable to take care of any disease, to take care of any pathogen, any predator, nothing. Okay, look at our babies. Our babies, first of all, our mothers are stuck for 9 months with the babies inside them, and once the baby comes out, the baby is dependent on the mom parents for how long? For like years and years and years, right? At least 5-6 years, if not more. And even then, after 5-6 years, the baby is probably just able to totter around on its own. The baby, in order to become worthy of catching its own food, etc., that never happens. So the point I am trying to make over here is, why has all this happened? That has happened because in the context of humans, the focus of our selection has shifted entirely towards a cultural side. Okay, biologically, we have ended up escaping almost all the selection pressure, because of which, although culturally we are pretty decent, although culturally we can accomplish a lot, from the biological side, we have ended up becoming worthless organisms. And this is true of pretty much all the cases where selection has happened in strongly, either in nature or in the lab. So the main point I am trying to make over here is that selection does not lead to perfection of any kind. Okay, lots of people, lots of students have this thing, oh, selection has perfected this trait over millions of years. No, selection has not done any such thing. Selection has simply blindly kept on increasing the fitness along a particular axis along which the selection has been happening. Period. Done. Whether it has led to perfection or not, selection doesn't bother. And as I showed you with the human example, in most of the cases, almost all the cases, there is no concept of perfection. And because there is no concept of perfection, there is also no concept of a higher organism or a lower organism, right? Now, this is a term that we use all the time. right. This is a higher organism and that is a lower organism. Humans and dogs and all mammals are higher organisms, and let us say bacteria and other things, they are lower organisms. Absolutely not. Each organism exists in a certain context, and the organism is trying to do well within that context. That is all selection is trying to make it do. You can talk about levels of complexity, more complex organism, less complex organism, in terms of how many things, how many kinds of tissues and so on and so forth. You can talk in terms of age of the organism. Okay, this organism came into being so many millions of years, but that one came into being whatever 10x millions of years earlier. So, this is a more ancestral form, this is a more recent form. You can talk along those lines. But talking about higher organisms or talking about lower organisms makes zero sense, simply because, as I showed you, there is no organism which is perfect. Selection never leads to perfection, right? And of course, correlated to this is, there is no plan of nature either. Selection is a blind force. Okay, whichever way fitness increases, selection will take the organism that way, period, done, over, right. So, unfortunately, this higher organism, lower organism term is very popular, and to be very honest, even I end up saying higher organism, lower organism now and then, but in the proper sense, proper technical sense, these labels actually do not have any meaning. And of course, there are all kinds of moral and ethical issues with that. If you have no higher organism or no lower organism, then does a human being have the right to take an animal's life? Okay, killing a human is almost universally a crime, but killing, let us say, a goat or killing, let us say, a cat is not a crime. Why not? We are higher, they are lower, but I just told you that there is no higher, there is no lower. So, in that case, how exactly do you justify taking any life? Okay, if you are saying, let us say, moving versus non-moving, how do you justify, let us say, taking the life of a plant? Okay, you cannot, because after all, the plant is also a living organism and is doing extremely well under whatever niche it exists, under whatever condition it exists. So, anyway, those are the kinds of debates that emanate from evolutionary thinking. We are not going to get into those kinds of debates in the context of this particular course, but there are lots of places where exactly these kinds of debates are done by people, and when they look at evolution to tell them what is the scientific basis of it, all we tell them is that, look, we do not think that there is a higher organism or a lower organism. All organisms are whatever they are, that is about it. Okay, so we are going to stop over here, and in our next discussion we are going to look at the other forces of evolution, things like drift and inbreeding, etc. And we are also going to look at how some of them end up interacting with selection and these forces. Okay, so see you in the next module.